Thank you, David, for that warm introduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Liam O'Callaghan and I'm Chair of the Board's Social Justice Committee. We're here tonight to talk about climate change, a phenomenon that is challenging our political system, our environment and our very existence on this fragile blue orb we call Earth. With me today are 4 members of our community who are intimately involved in the fight against climate change. Joel Lazar is the current CEO of the Jewish Climate Network, an organisation that aims to catalyse the Jewish community to support and strongly advocate for action on climate change. He was born and raised in the Melbourne Jewish community and has held various leadership positions in the Jewish youth movements and synagogues. Joel's commitment to social justice in a Jewish context culminated in him receiving the Ron Caston Young Humanitarian Award in 2019. Professor Danielle Celermajer is a Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Sydney, Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute and leader of the Multi-Species Justice Project. A long-time human rights scholar and activist, in recent years she has turned her attention to injustices and violence against the more than human. Through the experience of living through the Black Summer bushfires with the multi-species community, she began writing about a new crime of our age, omnicide, the death of all things. We're also joined by Rabbi Danny Eisenberg, who grew up in Sydney and studied for 9 years at the Gush Yeshiva in Israel. He received his rabbinic ordination from the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. He also earned a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from UNSW. From 2015 to 2020, he worked as a software engineer at the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Climate System Science, where he became interested in the nexus of Judaism and climate change. He's currently the director of the Sydney Kollel, involved in generating Jewish adult educational opportunities. Ethy Levy is a former Israeli Trade Commissioner to Australia, a former senior economic advisor to the President of Israel, the founder of Impact Innovation Israel, a strategic consultancy firm focusing on tech and innovation in sectors where there is a substantial impact on society and the environment, and she currently works in the impact investment space as a fund manager for Kinneret Impact Ventures. Let's give a warm welcome to all of our panellists. So we might kick off with quite an obvious question, but also one that I think has profound implications. What is climate change and how will it affect our lives in Australia if we do nothing? I might first pass to Joel Lazar of the Climate Network, Jewish Climate Network.
Sure. Can you hear me, Liam, all right, from here?
Yep.
Great. This hybrid world, I don't even know where I exist at the moment. Am I a cyborg? Am I human? Am I real? It's great to be here tonight and have this opportunity to share this really important conversation with everyone. Well done, Liam, and everyone at the Board of Deputies for putting it on. I think it really shows that our community has progressed a tremendous amount. The fact that we're devoting the climate plenum, the topic of this plenum tonight, to climate from a range of angles. So it's really exciting. I think to try and answer that question really briefly, what is climate change? I think an analogy that's useful to think about is that of a blanket, a person in a blanket. And the analogy here is a blanket is emissions. When you wear a blanket, it's warm, and the thicker the blanket gets, the warmer it gets inside that blanket. In the analogy to climate change, that blanket is emissions. Emissions is carbon dioxide, it's methane, it's a range of emissions that we've been spilling into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, I would say, primarily. And as we've emitted more, the blanket has gotten thicker and the Earth has gotten hotter. The implications of a hotter Earth are that it increases the risks of extreme weather events, the frequency, the intensity, the duration of extreme weather events. Their extreme weather events have been happening forever, since the dawn of time, since our planet first emerged. But what man-induced or human-induced climate change does is it increases the frequency of those things. So things you might have seen once every 500 years or once every 1,000 years, you might see now once every 10 years or once every 5 years or once every 2 years. In terms of its impacts on Australia, every climate and weather system is different. So in Australia, we have a proclivity towards bushfires, towards extreme heat days in the summer, floods and cyclones. So those things are, in the normal course of events, natural to Australia, but under human-induced climate change, we see a lot more of those and a lot more intensely.
Great, thank you so much for that, Joel. I might pass to Ethy. Maybe you can also talk about how climate change will impact Israel if we do nothing, and maybe what impacts you think about the most.
Sure. So thank you for having me tonight and for organizing the panel. Um, my focus when I look at climate is really on agriculture and food. And I think that it's a very important aspect of climate change that we need to take into consideration. And I think that's one of the areas where Israel can really make a difference globally. When we look at climate change, like Joel mentioned, it's extreme weather, it's difficulty to predict what is going to happen with the weather, and that has a tremendous effect on agriculture. Um, Today, we see, even with what happens, what is happening in Ukraine and Russia, how it affects the global food situation, food safety. Israel is a big importer of grains from Ukraine, and other countries as well in the same situation where we're unsure what is going to happen in the coming months. So I think that really the part that I would like to focus tonight, and also speak about where Israel can really make a difference, is in the areas of food safety, global food safety, not just for Israel but for the world. And things and technologies that we've been working on for decades since the establishment of the state can now really bring a tremendous change and security in those areas, and attenuate the effects of climate change.
Fantastic. And Professor, was there anything that you wanted to add to that, and maybe, think what drivers of climate change you think most about when you think of it?
I'd like to just approach it slightly differently, because I think we've come to a point where climate denialism is a very peripheral phenomenon now. There is broad acceptance of anthropogenic climate change, but I think there are still three illusions that we need to dispel ourselves of if we're going to take climate change as seriously as it needs to be taken in our own lives. The first is that it's happening elsewhere. The second is that it's going to happen at another time. And the third, that it's happening in the environment, but not to us. So the first two are very easy to dispel. In the last 2 years on the east coast of Australia, we've had the worst bushfires in the history of the continent. We've now had 3 major flood events, despite the fact that we have the moniker of the 1,000-year flood or the 100-year flood still being pulled up. We've now had 3 in 2 years. So it's happening now and it's happening here. It's not happening in the Pacific. It's not happening in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh. It's happening in Australia. Australia is particularly vulnerable to climate events, sea level rise, ocean acidification, the types of weather events that you've already been talking about. But it's the third one that I just want to spend a moment on, this notion that it's happening in the environment. And that is consistent with the same pathology of how we think about human beings that's got us into this problem, that somehow human beings float over and above the environment. Yes, of course, we've developed enormous technology that has allowed us to in many ways transcend the type of historical dependence that human beings have had the environment. But we also know, and science tells us this, and this is what COVID has just given us the experience of, that we are deeply entangled with the environment, that we are of the earth. We are earth beings like other earth beings. And so, and this gets to the second part of the question, climate change will affect every aspect of our lives. So as Ethy said, it will affect our food systems, it will affect water availability, but it will also affect the stability of our institutions. The type of political unravelling that we're beginning to see. What's happening in the Ukraine, of course, it's a multi-dimensional problem, but the dependence on fossil fuel is a very significant part of the problem. There are many analysts who say that many of the conflicts in the Middle East have been driven by climate change related issues. So political instability, institutional instability, and just the everyday conditions of life that allow us to be in our families, to be in our communities, to be in our workplace. I know, working at the university, the research, medical research, social science research, humanities research has been radically disrupted over the last 2 years because of COVID, because of climate events. So it's not out there, it's not only in the extreme, it's very much in the everyday. And I think that's what we really need to start to internalise, that what we most value about our lives, our relationship, our work, our creativity, our ability to worship together, all of that is going to be affected. It's already being affected.
Thank you, Professor. And I might pass now to Rabbi Eisenberg for the final word on that question. What does climate change mean to you?
So for me, thank you very much for having me here. It's a wonderful opportunity. For me, the primary issue is a phrase that I heard from a climate scientist in America, Professor Catherine Hayhoe, who speaks of climate change as a threat multiplier, which means that essentially all the kinds of situations that we've been in, and this has already been said by the previous speakers, these situations that we've experienced very disruptive last couple of years, whether it's from bushfires, whether it's from COVID, etc., these kinds of events are going to be, we can expect the probabilities to increase that these events will happen again, and they'll be more severe. So if you think COVID was a big deal, well, you know, it's this is not a small concern. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a second element that I think that while it's very, very important that we do not understate this issue, I also think it's very important that we don't overstate it as well. What do I mean? Sometimes you see slogans that people present which talk about that the end of the world is nigh, that essentially we're facing an Armageddon. And I can just say from my own experience of speaking with climate scientists, these ideas are not so much. I mean, it depends how you define your terms. What do you consider an Armageddon? But at the end of the day, the situation is something that's urgent. We have to deal with it, but it's not literally the end of the world. And I'll tell you why I think that's very important. First of all, because sometimes what happens is people make predictions, and those predictions are very doomsday-ish, and they don't come about. And it's ultimately, aside from being dishonest, ultimately it undermines our credibility. Because if you make warnings that don't come true, so then people say, it's just a mishegas, just a fringe movement that making up inaccuracy. So that's one important issue. Second of all, it just creates divisiveness within the community. It's hard to. One of our main problems is trying to galvanize everyone together to try and work on this issue. And when you say things which are inaccurate or you go over the top, that puts people's back up, and then people don't want to. People become very hesitant and don't want to support you, and they want to fight you, and that's a real problem. And the third reason why I think it's really problematic is that that kind of talk also leads people to feel despair in our future. And we as Jews should never feel despair. We've gone through a hell of a lot, but we've always been optimistic, and it's always important to remain optimistic. And young people have been found to experience tremendous anxiety about what they think the future holds for us. And so it's important for us, no matter how concerned we are about this issue, not to lose our optimism. I just wanted to add that point.
Optimism and activism. I might pass back to you, Rabbi. So why should Jews be involved in the fight against climate change? And, you know, what is unique about the Jewish experience, our traditions, our religion that should impel us to, you know, rush into the fight against climate change?
Yeah, so the ideas, the issues, the threats that are involved with climate change really go to the very heart of some of Judaism's central values. We all know Judaism focuses on the sanctity of human life, the concept of pikuach nefesh, how it's important to spare no expense to try and save lives. And we know that many lives will be at risk, many from the various damage that climate change can wreak. That's number one. There's a separate issue, which is that Judaism focuses on the idea that we are not meant to merely control the world, but we are meant to be stewards of the world. There's a beautiful rabbinic teaching in Midrash that says that when God created the world, he took Adam and Eve for a tour around the Garden of Eden. And God showed them how beautiful everything was, how perfect everything was. And God said, just make sure you don't mess it up. Because if you do, no one's going to come and clean it up after you. So essentially what this is telling us is that it's our responsibility to look after the world, look after ourselves and the planet. And this is a central idea. Like the miracle of Purim that we're now going to be celebrating, God is behind the scenes calling the shots, but ultimately requires heroism from Queen Esther and Mordecai to be able to bring about God's vision. So these are central issues. There's other sources which talk about the importance of not destroying nature, Bal Tashchit, not destroying fruit trees. There's a lot of focus on this issue. However, I also want to say that the focus should not just be on the environment, because once again, if you talk about environmentalism, so if you focus on from that perspective, environmentalism is something that motivates some people. Some people are into the environment, some people are not into the environment. But if I ask you, for example, about having clean water, is having clean water an environmental issue? So, or is that something that should only be the interest of environmentalists? So it's clearly nobody will tell you that having clean water is just an environmentalist focus. By calling it an environmentalist issue, what you're doing is you're narrowing down to as an interest group. Whereas what we want to be trying to do, in my opinion, is we have to focus on this issue as it's a human issue, just like having clean water is a human issue. So too, it's just common sense. We're looking after ourselves and looking after our planet. And it's not something that only people, it doesn't matter, whether you give a hoot about the owls and the whales or you don't. But ultimately, looking after our planet is an essential requirement for everybody all across the political and religious spectrum.
Thank you, Rabbi. I might pass now to Ethy. So what Jewish values are invoked when they're talking about climate change action in Israel, and how has that debate progressed there?
Sure. So I think that as the rabbi just mentioned, there's so many links between Judaism and the environment, the planet. I think that Judaism in itself is about living in harmony with our environment. So if we look at many of the chukim and Rabbi mentioned Shemitah. I think that Shemitah is exactly about soul regeneration and giving the land the possibility to rest and restore itself. Bal Tashchit is very, very broad, and it's for me it relates exactly to food waste. If we look at food waste, it's 8% of the global emissions. It's a huge number. It's more than the whole transportation, and we had that in our Sefer HaChukim many, many years ago. So I think that Judaism is really about making sure we leave the place as it is, or even better than we received it. For me, when I look at climate change, and it's all about trying to look at it in several angles. First of all, how to cope with the situation and how to make sure that again people have enough food, have good living conditions, and water is a very, very important issue, an issue that Israel has been leading the world for many years, providing technologies to minimize the use of water, to clean the water, bring water anywhere in the world. But it's also about how do we slow down the process that has started and that it's inevitable. And here there's a very, very interesting change in Israel in the what we call the startup ecosystem or the tech ecosystem, that we have now groups of entrepreneurs that are focusing on reducing the effect of climate change, slowing down the effect of climate change. And it comes from many different angles. It comes from using artificial intelligence, using engineering, really using all the different assets that we have as a tech ecosystem, and tunneling this powerhouse to the climate situation. And I think that we're going to see some really exciting solutions in the coming years. I think that it's the first time that even foreign countries are approaching Israel and encouraging Israel to focus on this sector. We've had countries from the EU, the UK, different global organization and international organization that have really approached Israel to come and look at this topic and focus on it. So I think that first of all, it's very exciting to see that we are recognized as a people that is able to make a difference in that space. And what I see, in my environment is that many second-time and third-time entrepreneurs that are now looking at the next venture, because we're Israeli and we never rest. When they think about what they want to do next, it's climate. It's really that's what drives them. And I meet almost every day entrepreneurs that are coming from cybersecurity or financial technologies, or they were in the defense, in engineering and robotics. And what they want to do today is fight climate. So it's, Rabbi mentioned before, Rabbi Eisenberg mentioned before, optimism. I'm very optimistic when I see, those very, very bright people coming and focusing their efforts on not fighting climate change, but really trying to slow down and trying to find solutions for people in developing countries where the effect of climate change is the highest, and they don't always have the means to cope with the situation. So there's also a very interesting trend of taking existing technologies and adapting them for third world countries so that they're more affordable and more accessible. And I think that that's a very important human and social aspect of the effect of climate change, and how do we provide the tools to those people in need to be able to access those solutions.
Fantastic. Anything you want to add to that, Joel, as well? I mean, what do people talk about when they sign up to the Jewish Climate Network? What values do they invoke? And what do you tell people about why they should be involved in your organisation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't want to repeat what's been said before. All these Jewish values are present, they're live. Judaism has all of these principles that drive us and have always driven us. One key idea which really motivates me and motivates a lot of people in the community to join JCN and join the fight, I guess, and seize the opportunities, is that the Australian Jewish community, I'd say the Jewish people in general, we punch above our weight on so many issues. Like, we're a tiny people. This is a message that many in the room tonight will have heard. We're a tiny people in the scheme of things, and we have achieved great things, and we continue to achieve great things. And if we only decide that this is an issue that we wish to be a leader on, we will be a leader on this. That's literally the only thing that stands between us being a global leader on this and a light unto the nations and all of those things. And it's just that decision to do so, and to become the entrepreneurs of the future and all that kind of stuff that Ethy was talking about, and we will be. So that's very inspiring for me, the fact that we have that leadership capacity and that talent and those resources and those connections and networks, and that we can deploy all of those for this great generational mission that we're on.
Fantastic. And this is also something that you've thought about quite deeply, Professor, and it's something that you touch on in your book. Isn't that right?
Thank you. So you asked both about values and about experiences, so I wanted to say something about both. And I thought I might answer both with a story. So the first one on values, one value that I was very strongly brought up with was L'Ador V'Dor, is intergenerational responsibility. And if I might, I'm just going to read a couple of pages from Summertime, which is the book that I wrote during and in the wake of the Black Summer fires. Isaac was my grandfather. He came on a boat to Australia with Hella, my grandmother, and John, my father, in April 1950. Right after the end of the war, they fled from Poland to Paris, and it was from there that they obtained refugee status and a passage to Australia. When the three of them arrived in Australia with barely a word of English, they virtually stopped speaking their native tongue. Their lives were, and I came to understand, had to be about the future. As he had learned from his Jewish forebears, everything that Isaac did was oriented towards the community he felt part of and to the lives of his grandchildren and their children down 7 generations, people who did not yet exist and whom he would never know, but whose yet-to-be lives guided his. It is one of the human qualities that takes your breath away, the capacity to be consciously present, not only to what you make from what is immediately in front of you in time and space, but to what that could become long after you are gone. We continue to draw nourishment from the spring he opened. When I turned 50, it occurred to me that it was my turn to live towards 7 generations. It sounds like a romantic idea, but when you actually go about realising it, you start to fathom the difficulty of the task, to orient yourself and to start to act in ways that are given by your care for future lives whose context and shape will always remain opaque to you. It means imagining not only what those lives might be like, but what nourishment they might most need. And even if you have a model to inspire you, as I did with Isaac, your time is not their time. 2014 was not 1950. When I tried to look forward, to feel forward, what seemed most vital was access to fertile land and sources of clean water, and along with that, lifeways and understandings that would have those 7 generations feel at home on and delighted by, grateful for and responsible to the earth and the other beings who supported and accompanied them. That is what had us find our way to this valley, and that is why the most magnificent tree in our midst bears the name Isaac. So that's the first answer. And the second, I also want to answer with a story. So after the fires, several weeks after the fires, when I was processing the trauma, I called my therapist, who I hadn't seen for a couple of years, and I was talking to her about it. And she knows me very well. She knows that I'm the child of Holocaust survivors. And there was a point in the conversation where I said, I never actually realised that it could all be destroyed. And she said to me, yes, you did. And that's something that I have found in my conversation with children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, that we know that worlds can be destroyed. We know that everything we take for granted can be taken away from us. We also know that we can live in denial that everything can be taken away. And that knowledge, which we bear as such a burden on our souls, is a tremendous gift, because the difficulty that we have in imagining, we've had 10,000 years of the Holocene. We have the epigenetics of climate stability. It is incredibly difficult for us to imagine that this home, this hospitable home that has been given to us, could become an inhospitable home. But Jews don't have difficulty imagining that. We know that to be so. And so I think with that comes a very powerful responsibility to take that capacity to imagine into the praxis of our lives.
No, absolutely. No, thank you for that. And we must do something to avert that climate catastrophe. So I might now go to our final question before we take questions from the audience, and I'll pass on to Ethy because I know she has to leave soon. How can we in our organisations fight climate change in our daily lives and operations? And are you able to tell us a little bit about your work or approach, or how your work or approach provides a response to the challenge?
Sure. Thank you, Liam. So Joel, started before talking about emissions, and I think that emissions is kind of the first step that we can address relatively easily, trying to reduce our emissions in every decision that we make in our organization. I lived in Australia, and I know how easy it is to take a flight and commute. Not in the past 2.5 years, but in general. So I think that that would be, the first step that we can look at. In the sectors that I deal with, working with agriculture and the food industry, there's so much that we can do to improve the situation. We are now working on a big vision, a big solution for reducing food waste, especially what happens at the farm, on farm, which is about 30% of the food waste, which usually the farmer pays the price for that. And it's actually using an Australian technology, but commercialized by an Israeli group. So I think that every one of us can look in different sectors that is active into the immediate steps that you can make, but also look at the longer term and see, analyze where are the big issues that could be addressed. In Israel, as I said, there is now several groups that are focusing on carbon emission solutions, also alternative energy. It was mentioned before, fossil fuel is a big issue, not just for climate, but also for some of the more political kind of global activities. In Israel, it has been one of the goals of the government for a long period of time to focus on renewable energy and to invest in that space tremendously. So today we see not only in solar and geothermal, but we also see lots of hydrogen technologies that are being developed, and strong commitment of companies, organizations, the state to move into renewable energies. So I think that that's a very important step that, Australia has been leading in that space for many years. But here we are really focusing on developing the technologies that enable this shift, not only in Israel, but globally. And I think that it's important to come back to that aspect that, when Israel is looking at developing new technologies, it's from day one, we're looking at technologies that can be used globally. And that's, really the big impact that we can have on that space. Because if we focus just on Israel, it's nice to have, but it's not going to move the needle. The other areas are really related to the supply chain. I think that we don't focus enough in that space, but supply chain and logistics are really one of the big emission. The big emission come from those spaces, and that's an area where software and optimization of the supply chain using artificial intelligence and analyzing the data and the best possible ways to change supply chain as it is today. That's a big area of focus, and I'm very optimistic about that area specifically. Moving into more localized production, I think that's also an area that we're going to see more and more. So these are the key, trends that we see in Israel when we look at climate change and trying to change some of the areas that today are the big polluter. Let's call it that way. The last area maybe that I would like to mention is also all the area of food production and alternative proteins. I'm sure you've read in the news about Israeli being a global player in the alternative proteins. We've had tens of companies being established in that space. And it's not just the alternative meat, that is very, lots of marketing around it, but it's something that are more in the core of providing enough protein for the population in ways that are more sustainable. And we see that, for example, in aquaculture. So lots of solutions in the area of aquaculture to make the production of fish more efficient and more sustainable, and also different sources of proteins, also from plant proteins extraction and additional technologies in that space. So I think that the meat is the alternative meat is the one that is in the news and that we hear a lot about it, but that's it's not the key focus, and lots of work being done at the Hebrew University and any other research institutes in Israel, really to try and bring production of plant-based protein in a sustainable manner and to replace some of the protein production which today are big emitters. That would be the areas that I would highlight as in terms of what's happening in Israel in that space.
Thank you, Ethy. I might now pass to you, Rabbi. I mean, you spoke before about, not catastrophizing that and realizing that we can actually do something from the problem. I mean, what advice would you give to, Jewish organizations and Jewish individuals to reduce their impact on the environment and on climate change?
Great question. Thank you. I think that, when we're trying to see what we can do that actually makes a difference, reducing our own personal carbon footprint might feel like, well, that's just a tiny drop in a massive ocean. And I think what's important to realize is that in order for real large-scale change to happen, there needs to be a sort of a ground shift in terms of where society is holding, and that means that people who ordinarily would not think that this is their issue, I mentioned this before, will recognize, no, this is an issue for all of us, and it's not just an environmentalist issue. And you see, for example, in the United Kingdom, they were the first to actually get a real commitment to zero net emissions by 2050. And the reason they were able to do that was because they had recognized on a bipartisan level across the board, across the political spectrum, they said this is an issue that all of us have to be concerned about. And so from my point of view, what we have to try and do is we have to expand the conversations that we're having so that organizations can have conversations about this issue. The more we speak about it and the more we make decisions about it, the more it will be seen as a normal mainstream issue that everybody should buy into. So I see that as really a key thing, and every organization can have that conversation or can have an ongoing conversation about that in order to help normalize that issue. As an Orthodox rabbi, I think I can see that being placed where I am gives me a unique opportunity because I'll just give you an example of that. That recently a group of major modern Orthodox rabbis, religious Zionist rabbis in Israel, came together and wrote a letter to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett before he went to the Glasgow Climate Summit, and urging him to represent, to take action and to do something and represent the Jewish voice. And Prime Minister Bennett said to people, people said to me, we think, don't you think climate summit, isn't that a bit of a left-wing thing to do? And you're pretty right-wing. And he said, well, look, I've got rabbis from the right wing, religious Zionist right wing, all encouraging me. So you have to get your priorities straight. You have to understand the landscape properly. It's not a left-wing issue. So I think as an Orthodox rabbi, I'm uniquely placed to be able to try and work with maybe a more conservative constituency and try and get that issue happening as a normal issue within that realm. One of the things I'm doing together with Joel, actually, we'll be speaking to the Rabbinical Council of Victoria rabbis, giving professional development to discuss how they can be involved in the climate. And there are tremendous opportunities within the rabbinic leadership to be able to make a big impact, because if the people on the conservative side of politics want to do something about it, then everyone's going to want to do something about it.
Fantastic. That's, very optimistic. Professor?
The rabbi and Ethy have given really comprehensive answers to what organisations can do, so I don't want to repeat anything that they've said. I want to very much reinforce what the rabbi just said about having safe and honest conversations in organisations so that there's a normalisation of talking about climate change. Unfortunately, we do have a situation in this country where climate debates have been extremely politicised, and despite the fact that climate-related events do not see the colour of your politics, it has become a very strong right-left issue in this country. And so I think it's incumbent. We still are in the fortunate position where we live in a liberal democracy that everybody uses their vote as a citizen to communicate to whatever party it is that you're affiliated with, that representing what is a life-saving position on climate change, which is meeting a realistic policy plan for 2050 zero emissions, but really halving emissions at least by 2030, so we have to have a realistic plan, is where we need to be communicating as citizens and through our organisations. And the second point that I would make is, and this is an organisational point as well as an individual point, is I think it's incumbent on organisations to divest from all types of investments that are in any way supporting the fossil fuel industry. And that doesn't just mean having your investments in the green part of a fund. It means divesting from any investment company that has a non-green fund, because that will message to investment companies and, you know, climate scientists and climate economists have been saying this for a long time. Where the money goes, the investments will go. And if we move our investments out of any companies that are in any way working in the fossil fuel sector, then that will move the incentive structure. So I think that is a very practical and immediate thing that we can do.
Thank you. I might, just before I pass to Joel for the final point on this question, just a reminder that if you have any questions that you want to send to the panel, there's a number just up on the screen. Joel for the final word.
No problem. All agree with all those answers. All I think I would add to it is to provide an acronym for people to remember tonight, which I find really useful on this, and it's TEMP, which is TEMP, which is very easy to remember in the context of climate change. And TEMP stands for talk, energy, money, and politics. And all of those things were referred to in the last 5 minutes or so. Talking is the normalization of climate. You can't solve a problem that you don't talk about. Energy is around your emissions. So organizations and companies can all reduce their emissions through switching to green energy, solar, etc. Money is exactly what Danielle or the professor just said right now. And politics is engaging with politics. Again, just as the professor just said, it doesn't matter what party you vote for. Everybody could be doing better on climate. The great thing is, I mean, JCN was really formed to provide resources and tools to the Australian Jewish community to do those four things, TEMP. So I'm hoping after this evening tonight concludes, you know, we'll be able to share some links around that make each of those four things, talk, energy, money, and politics, really, really easy to do. So yeah, that's all I would say on that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joel. I'll go to the first question that we've got from the audience. So this is from Sharon Margenberg from the Jewish Sustainability Initiative, which is a local activist group around the field of climate change. So her question is, given that the Jewish Board of Deputies represents a broad spectrum of the Jewish community in New South Wales and is the roof body of all our New South Wales communal organisations, what advice can the panel give the Board of Deputies on how to move forward from today and best engage the Jewish community in order to make our community leaders understand the impacts of climate change and work towards a net zero future? I might go to Rabbi Eisenberg.
Thank you. I think that in line with what essentially what I was saying before is about trying to encourage conversations. So I think along those lines, the Board of Deputies, I suppose, internally would want to start the ball rolling on having those conversations if they haven't already, and then they can essentially start providing developing action points in terms of what the next steps are, because essentially the Board of Deputies has such a wide reach. They can essentially chart that path together.
Great. I might pass to Eddie before she has to jump off.
Sorry, I was just texting you that I have to leave, but sure, sorry. So yeah, I think that maybe I will just, say maybe a final message before I have to go to this all the agricultural organizations of Israel meeting today, and among other dealing with climate change and what can those agricultural organizations have to do. So that's why I have to leave you. But I think that my message will be that, as Joel mentioned, first of all, it's not anymore an environmentalist issue. It's an issue of all of us in our day-to-day life, and talking about it is very important. So it's as we say mainstream, and actions are very important. We're Israeli, we're about tachles, and if we can each one of us take one action from the panel tonight, from the discussion, and see how we can do it in our home, but also in our workplace. And if we can, bring others to do that, would be even better. But really, action would be the key. Do something. Start with something. And I think that the third message, I think, is really optimism. And we've mentioned that before, but I think that if we're optimistic, then we know that we can change things and we can make a difference, and we can definitely attenuate some of the effects and slow down the effect. And hopefully that will make us better consumers, but also, better human beings. So that will be my conclusion for tonight. And apologies again that I have to leave early. Thank you very much. Toda rabba, and Purim Sameach to everyone.
Thank you, Ethy. Purim Sameach. I might now pass. Would you like to add anything to that question, Professor?
No, I think they're good answers. Joel might have something to say, and I'd rather hear other questions than hear me.
Fantastic. Joel?
My brief point on that would be, I think the greatest leadership role that the Board of Deputies could play on this is to make climate a core issue on the Jewish agenda, besides some of the other core issues that historically have been on its agenda, knowing that it has such an impact on some of the other important issues that we historically care a lot about. So that would be the main high-level point. And the second point would be, I'm available. This is my role. My role is to engage with the Board of Deputies and all of the members of the Board of Deputies at any point, email, call, and to help guide your journey and find that unique way that you can address the issues. So that's what I'm here. I'm a community resource for you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joel. I might now go to a final question. So how do you address people who deny the existence, the scope, or the threat of climate change? And what are your most successful arguments, particularly for members of our community? I might go back to you on this, Joel.
Well, like the professor said earlier, it is a group that is getting smaller and smaller. Over 80% of Australians across every political persuasion, ideology, religion, ethnicity, doesn't matter what it is, over 80% now completely agree that it is a major concern that needs to be addressed. So I don't spend as much attention on it because we have such a short period of time to make the biggest impact possible. I try to work as much as possible with those who are driving the solutions. But also I come at it with a lot of compassion because, in my opinion, I think if somebody is still deeply skeptical or denying of an idea that has already been established widely, conclusively in news, media, science, economics, etc., they're trying to defend some aspect of maybe their identity or their personality, and that's perfectly natural. There are things that I don't want to accept, say, in my own life, which I probably deep down kind of know that are a real issue or really true, but I'm not really ready to engage with it or ready to have a deep conversation about it. And it comes, I don't think it comes from a malicious place. I think, everyone is deeply good at heart. I really do believe. So I just try and treat that with as much compassion as possible, listen to that person, hear why they have concerns, and hopefully try and find some common ground. I don't think there's one kind of zesty answer, which is the answer to blow away all arguments. It's not really about the substance of the argument. It's more about what's going on for that person and having a really genuine human conversation with them.
I know we were talking before, Professor, that this was an issue that you kind of struggled with as well. What have your thoughts been on the matter, and have you had, especially after your close personal experiences with, the changing climate, how have you been able to sort of convey that to people who are initially or still are sceptical?
I very much agree with what Joel said, and I just really want to take my hat off to him for approaching it with compassion, because I have to say I don't often feel compassion. I feel rage. But the truth is I think that the very few climate change deniers who are around, they take a lot of oxygen in the room, and I just don't think it's where our time needs to be. That said, if I was directly engaging with someone who was denying the reality of anthropogenic climate change, I would definitely not argue. Arguing facts we know this in relation to all sorts of denialism. Arguing facts does not make a difference. In fact, arguing facts just hardens positions, because it's about ideology, about personality, about identity. It's not about facts. And the third thing that I would do, and we see this very much around Australian farmers, many Australian farmers deny anthropogenic climate change, but they don't deny the effects that it's having on their farms. And so if you are problem focused, if you are like, what is it that you're caring about? What is happening in your life to a place that you love or to something that's important in your life, and how do we find solutions to deal with that? Without actually having to have a conversation about how do we diagnose the problem, I think that there are smart ways of just moving to the solution as opposed to dwelling on the problem, if it's important to have a conversation with those people. But like I said, when there are 93% of people in the room who are not denying anthropogenic climate change, I think we have to stop worrying about convincing that 7%, because that's pretty much true with any political debate.
Thank you for that. And we might now pass to Rabbi Eisenberg for the final word before we wrap up, just on that question.
Yeah, I think those are very mature, helpful responses, both from Joel and Professor Celermajer. I would say that in most cases, you can't really beat a diehard debater, but there are many people, I think, who sit on the fence, and I think you can make a difference to them if you try and show them. For me, I have one go-to website which I think is helpful, which is NASA's climate website, because I think NASA is a name that people trust. They know what they're talking about. They're not making up things from ideology. And if you just have a look on that website, the climate, nasa.gov/climate, you see that they're not presenting. It's not a debate. There's no debate there. It's all very clear-cut and well-established science. And I think that has a big impact on a lot of people who sit on the fence.
Thank you. And let's give our panelists a big hand. Hopefully tonight's discussion has informed and energised you. We don't want this challenge to be seen as too big for individual or communal action. We can each do our bit to fight climate change and prevent a climate collapse. Our Jewish tradition impels us to heal the world, and through upholding and living the ancient principle of tikkun olam, I believe we can once again punch above our weight and contribute meaningfully to addressing this crisis. Once again, can we thank our panelists tonight? And I'll pass back to David Ossip, our Vice President.